I'm Lucy.
And I'm Jennifer.
You're listening to Everything I Know About.
Each week, we share everything we know about a new topic, equipped with some internet research and a little too much exposure to pop culture.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, everyone.
Back to reality. Back to our normal schedule.
I'm excited to be back to weekly.
Me too. It just enables us to cover more like timely content.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, today we are talking about the Olympics, which it was really fun to research, and I'm so excited to chat about it, but it does feel like we kind of are a little bit late to the game on this. Hopefully this is still on people's minds, but I think the angle that we're bringing to it, talking more about the economic impact of hosting the Olympics and sort of the more long-term look at it, is relevant anytime. But yeah, having a more weekly schedule gives us the ability to respond to what's going on in the culture and around us more quickly, for sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Paralympic Games hasn't even started yet. So that's going to go from August 28th to September 8th.
So we're not late. Did they do the closing ceremony?
Yes.
Or do they wait till after the...
No, they're technically two different events.
They should wait until after the Paralympic Games are over to do the closing ceremony.
Do they not have their own opening ceremony and closing ceremony?
I don't know. I didn't watch any Olympics this year.
I know.
So
You're so not in the loop.
I'm so out of the loop.
Yeah.
I usually like watching them, but we've just had some other things going on.
Right. It's funny. This year I've been more engaged than ever. But I feel like the experience of watching this year was so different because I'm actively on TikTok now, and the omnipresence of the Olympics felt a lot different because I would watch it on the TV, but then also see like so many memes and videos and jokes about the Olympics on my phone as I was just scrolling. So it definitely felt like it was the national conversation for the last 2 months.
Absolutely was. I feel like I watched the Olympics just by virtue of being on the internet.
Yeah, totally. Right when the Olympics was starting, I saw this video on TikTok of this woman who was like, ugh, whenever I see people chanting like USA, USA, that's so gross. I'm always like, ew, I don't want to be associated with those people. And then the Olympics rolls around and I'm the one in the video. She's decked out in all this USA Olympics gear. She's like, I'm the one chanting USA, USA. And I really related to that. It was this wild experience because Netflix released a bunch of these pre-Olympic documentaries right as the games were about to start. And so I watched the one with Simone Biles, her comeback story. They released a couple episodes talking about her experience at the Tokyo Olympics, and then more episodes are still coming. So they stopped filming right as she was getting ready for the Olympics that just happened in Paris. I'm like eagerly awaiting more episodes to come out about that. There was another one called Sprint about the track and field athletes, both men and women. And so I felt like since I knew a lot of the backstory of these athletes going into the games, I just felt way more invested and knew people's names and like goals. And when they won or didn't win, felt a lot of the emotion along with them. So I feel like that really changed my experience watching the games this year versus it being like, oh, okay, like it's great that athlete won, but like I don't really have an attachment to them or know their story beyond this one specific competition I'm watching.
Yeah, your story reminds me of how people always say sports are reality TV for men.
Right, I kind of get it. I literally watch zero sports, so me being like all sporty has been a new identity, but I love it. I don't know if it's going to transfer.
Men just like sit there and watch ESPN and read all of the articles about people's backstories and get invested into them as people. And then they watch on the field and they're like, no, you don't understand. It's powerful because I know who they are. And I'm like, this is just reality TV for men.
Yeah, I mean, it's so emotional. Like you really get wrapped up in the saga. So thank God for Peacock here. I was watching the summaries as I was doing work late at night. Maybe the really hardcore people are watching like truly every event, even the events where America doesn't medal. But for me, because I was watching the digest, they only show the events where the US medals.
Really?
Any like American athlete that medals, they're definitely in there. They do feature like France had a really dominant male swimmer this year. And a lot of his races were covered, even though it's not like there was a lot of US swimmers necessarily medaling in those same races. But yeah, I definitely feel like it gave a little bit of a skewed perception on reality because watching those recaps, it just feels like America's so dominant. And I did feel a big sense of national pride. So it's crazy. They didn't cover a lot of the Chinese medals. Usually it's always US and China head to head in terms of country with the most medals, you know?
What was it this year? I mean, I know US had the most medals overall, and then was it China number 2 still?
Yeah.
US and China really dominate with the gold medals. It's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, 40 gold medals each, and then the next highest, Japan, only had 20.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is also an interesting question I had that we're not covering today, but maybe in a future Olympics, like how countries become so dominant in certain sports. So like China swept diving. They got a ton of their gold medals from diving. They sweep ping pong. And then obviously in the United States, we're very dominant with gymnastics. Track and field is usually always between Jamaica and the US in terms of sprinting, at least. So yeah, it's fascinating how countries, I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? Because once you start winning, you get more resources to invest in your training programs. You can also attract athletes, coaches, right? And like probably a US gymnast seeing Simone Biles on TV might be like, oh, I can aspire to that. I could see myself in her. Whereas someone in a different country who doesn't have that type of role model in the media maybe would just never participate. So it makes sense. But I think it is fascinating how like it becomes such a national pride thing. I did watch some of the Chinese divers and, you know, they're scoring well above what other countries are scoring. Their diving, especially synchronized diving, is just truly perfect. But the amount of pressure they're under, even when they make a slight mistake, I feel like it's the whole country being like, you just messed up, you know? That's a lot on your shoulders for sure. I mean, Simone Biles talks about that too, right? With the amount of pressure when you're like not the underdog and you're just expected to like make it look easy and bring home the gold.
I couldn't imagine the pressure. So crazy.
Yeah. It's truly another level.
So today for the convo, we're going to talk more about the economic implications of hosting, how much it costs. Lucy's going to give us a deep dive on the China 2008 Olympics, and I have some research on the economic cost for France in this past Olympic Games. So Lucy, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah. So for today's topic, before we get into the meat of that conversation, I'm just going to give a very brief primer on the history. I didn't know it, and I think it's interesting and helpful context for the conversation later on. So I think the lore that a lot of people know is the first Olympics was held in Greece in 776 BC at Olympia to honor Zeus. And the Greeks actually began measuring time in Olympiads, which was the 4 years between each game. The competitions at that time were men only. They were naked. I feel like there was another fact in another episode where you were like, yeah, everyone was just naked all the time. When they're drinking wine and naked. But yeah, naked men competing. And the various Greek city-states sent athletes. And as we know, like these city-states were constantly warring and would actually declare a truce ahead of the Olympics so that their athletes could compete. The sports at that time were chariot racing, sprinting, wrestling. There was like a giant fighting game. Obviously, some of those sports we no longer do. And the other thing I thought was kind of interesting is like in parallel to these sport competitions, there was also cultural competitions. These weren't officially part of the Olympics. They were part of a different game, but music, art, singing, poetry were things that you could actually also compete on.
Wow.
And this ancient version of the Olympics stopped in 393 AD when Rome had already conquered Greece and banned it because they thought it was pagan.
Oh, please. They were pagan too, weren't they?
I guess this was like the Holy Roman Empire, right? Christianity
what
had
year
come.
was it?
393 AD. Do you know?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, that was post-Christianity, unfortunately.
Yeah. So the modern Olympics was revived in 1896 in Athens. It was a Frenchman who got a bunch of countries together and had a meeting in Paris to establish the International Olympic Committee a couple years before the first one in Athens. And Paris hosted the second one in 1900. Paris was the first one where women were also allowed to compete.
Got to compete in the Olympics before we could vote.
True. Yeah. Crazy. I was just looking at the stats on the Olympics, and now it's like 50-50 men and women. So progress. I also found this interesting. So from 1912 to 1948, there were also artistic competitions as a part of the modern Olympics. There was architecture, literature, music, painting, and sculpture. And you could win Olympic gold for those crafts.
It sounds like the World Fair.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we never hear about that, but for a good, 30 years, you could be an amazing sculptor and be like, yeah, I got Olympic gold.
I wonder if they make them do it in real time. You have 12 hours to create a sculpture if you, bring your work. How does that work?
How do you make it fair, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, people sneaking in to carve things at night or whatever.
It's probably why we don't do it anymore.
Yeah. Now, the Olympics includes so many different countries. It actually has even more countries than the UN. So the UN has 193 members, and there are 206 national Olympic committees in the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. So it's a huge part of our culture. It's crazy that it's been going on since the late 1800s, really without pause, with two exceptions of World War I and World War II.
Wild. So that gets us to our next question, which is how do we decide where the Olympics are hosted every year? This I actually found to be much more involved and interesting than I thought it was going to be. I thought it was like, oh, there's maybe some politics involved with this continent hasn't gotten an Olympic bid in a while, we'll put it there, or some sort of consensus is made, but that's not how it works at all. It is very involved, yes, very political. But essentially what happens is the International Olympics Committee, the IOC, they host a election by secret ballot, and every member has one vote. And this process of selecting the host country starts over a decade before the actual games happen. So we're talking like 11, 12 years beforehand. Over the course of 2 years, cities conduct marketing campaigns, and then they make plans to present to the IOC. It costs $150,000 for the entry bid for this phase. Countries spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars even, to hire consultants, create plans, and present it to the committee. They vote by secret ballot and then whittle it down to 3 to 5 finalist cities, who must then take another few years, submit really elaborate proposals, talk about how they're going to pay for the infrastructure, what the plans are going to be, what the vision is. And this final entry fee is $500,000. And then there is another vote that happens. So what goes into this is essentially who can actually pay for it, who can pull it off, and what the most ambitious plan is. The Olympic Committee wants to wow. They make almost all of their revenue off of broadcasting rights. So whoever can have the most elaborate games is going to win. And we'll get into this later, but it's interesting how that incentive structure really drastically inflates the cost of the Olympic Games for the host countries later on. So just to give you an idea of how much it costs, just to throw your hat into the ring, Tokyo spent $150 million on a failed Olympic bid in 2016.
Oh my God.
Yes, they didn't even get it. And so
this was just the plans. It's not like they built anything for this. This was just like, here's a PowerPoint presentation for why you should pick us.
Essentially, yes.
Oh my God.
Yes. I tried to look into why this is so expensive. It sounds like most of the cost is for the consultants that they hire.
Go figure.
Go figure, yeah. So there's a lot of planning and travel and organizational cost to this.
That's super interesting. I always knew it was a bidding process and like can get quite competitive in certain years if there's like a lot of countries interested. But it's fascinating that like this governing body truly has so much power. They're setting these really high standards. And they're also shaping a lot of the conversation around like why countries should even bid in the first place. Because obviously, given it's such an expensive process, you really need to want it. And I was just curious, like, what is the IOC's official language around this? Because obviously they're trying to convince countries to bid and to host. So I looked at some of their data, and they say that when they forecast, the benefits always outweigh the costs. Countries that are bidding include forecasts of their budget and how much revenue they expect to make. For Paris, the projection was that Paris should have a net gain of $7 to $12 billion. The way that they calculate that is they look at obviously expenditures and revenues. Expenditures, there's what's considered part of the Olympic budget, and specifically they exclude capital investments from this budget. Capital investments includes the sports facilities to host the games, any other kind of transport or infrastructure investment, technological infrastructure, conference, tourism facilities, accessibility, or any residential housing. And so the argument that IOC makes for how the budget ends up working out is you've got the privately funded portion of the budget that comes from the IOC and also revenue sources like sponsors, ticketing. Of course, there's also a public contribution in terms of security, medical, that taxpayers take on. But that public contribution is supposed to be offset by the benefits to the economy. So employment, increases in tourism, this amorphous bucket from hosting the games. And I was curious, how much does IOC actually contribute? And it does seem significant. Like they say that they contribute cash, services, and value in kind, totaling $1.7 billion. So that is the amount of money that they gave to Paris to host the Olympics. All of that is privately funded, right? So that is from broadcasting fees, as you just said, plus sponsorships from companies. So they say that for 10 Olympic Games from 2000 to 2018, these operational budgets, which they approved during the bid process, broke even or generated profit. Now, that being said, I looked at their information first and I was like, oh, okay, this doesn't seem that bad. And then like very quickly, I realized, oh, I guess they're like excluding a lot of things from this budget. And like actually the operating budget that countries are putting out there, is that even getting met? And there was a study done by Oxford University in 2020 that found that the operating cost of Olympics held since 1960 have actually averaged nearly 3 times what the host cities originally bid, calculating it the same way that the IOC presented it, which is not including wider capital costs. And every single Olympics has run over budget.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting that there's such a different narrative being put out there. What the IOC puts out is really misleading because a lot of this data is based on operating budgets submitted during the bid process and like proposals that the consultancy companies that these host countries have hired are obviously putting forth a plan that makes sense, that it's like, okay, you're not going to lose money on this. You know, you're going to make it back through all these ways and therefore there's X billions of net gain. When it comes down to it, countries are definitely exceeding their operating budget costs. So therefore, there is no profit. In fact, they're operating with a loss by hosting the games.
Yeah, definitely going on Olympics.com and seeing all of their info. First of all, I was shocked at how much transparency they seem to have on their website. They have so many articles answering every single question I have, but then you go into any other source and the information is completely opposite of what the Olympics is officially putting out. So to your point, the picture that they paint doesn't seem to be reality at all. Not only does the cost exceed the budget, but there was only one independently verified profitable games ever. And that was the 1984 Summer Olympic Games in LA. And there were a ton of factors that even went into why that was a profitable game. A few of them being LA was the only city to even enter the bid because the previous few Olympics, there were terrorist attacks and the public perception of the Olympics was pretty low. So the IOC gave them a ton of incentives to even host the games. LA agrees. LA already had really great infrastructure and was able to reuse some of their stadiums, didn't have to build them from scratch. And by the end of it, turned a $250 million profit. So good for them. But everybody else has been straddled with decades worth of debt from hosting the Olympics. And I found that so shocking. I knew the Olympics were extremely expensive to host. You see all of the huge infrastructure that needs to be built. I mean, we hear about what Paris had to do for the Seine even in the past few months with this. But to go over budget by literal billions of dollars that 3-4 generations have to pay off, I had no idea it was that bad. And then that begs the question, why do people throw their hat in the ring in the first place to host the Olympics? And I think part of it is the IOC paints this picture of like, you will have a lot of tourism revenue. Even some of the more business-minded journals that I was reading said that Paris could still turn a profit from this games. And part of it is the broadcasting revenue. Part of it is improvements in infrastructure are stuff that needed to happen anyway. So it's this long-term investment in the city. But also there tends to be a tourism boost that lasts well beyond the Olympics. It's not just that initial influx from everybody coming to watch, but it raises the profile of the city so much. A city like Paris, I'm like, okay, I don't know if it really needs the profile raised. But a good example of this is in the early 2000s, Barcelona hosted the games and they went from the 11th most visited city in Europe to the 6th most visited. But it's not like a guaranteed you host, you have tourism increase. London actually saw a dip in tourism during the Olympics. But now that the Olympics are so big and so popular, and it does cost billions and billions of dollars to host, it is much different than it used to be. Back in pre-broadcast television days, it was still expensive to host the Olympics, but it wasn't on the scale that it is today. And so the IOC has to make the argument that you just outlined. Whereas before, it was always kind of understood that you were going to absorb the cost of the Olympics, and it was just for pride, national pride. After the advent of broadcast television, when they had to make this spectacle that was going to be televised and really outdo themselves in the proposal process, and the costs went up drastically, we started to see a huge dip in the amount of cities that were even trying to get the bid for the Olympics. Denver, actually, in 1972, was the first city to reject an Olympic bid that they had won. The voters passed a referendum and they were like, we don't want to pay for this. And so they withdrew their proposal, which I thought was crazy. And Montreal is the huge symbol of the financial risks of hosting the Olympics. They hosted in 1976, and their proposal was expected to cost $124 million, which ended up being billions of dollars below the actual cost. And in the end, Montreal was straddled with $1.5 billion in debt, and it took them 3 decades to pay it off.
Yeah, and that's like taxpayers paying it off.
Yes. And what's so sad about this is money goes into building these highly specialized stadiums and buildings. Think about like water polo or something that it's never going to be used again, right? And so these buildings just sit. There's actually a term, they're called white elephants, these expensive specialized facilities. And they have limited post-Olympic use. And one huge example of this is Sydney's Olympic Stadium costs them $30 million a year to maintain still.
And nobody uses it?
And nobody uses it. Montreal's big stadium, it was called the Big O for like the big Olympic Stadium.
The Big O. I definitely thought something else.
I know, right? But they needed to redo the roof 3 times in this past time. They were like, we just have to demo this thing because at this point, it's not even worth keeping up. And this kind of reminds me of the World's Fair. I know I brought this up earlier, but the more that we're like talking about the Olympics, I'm like, this really sounds like back in the day when these cities would build these huge buildings and they kind of sit there. But you go tour in Europe, for instance, and you see the Grand Palais in Paris and they're like, why did they build this? The World's Fair. Or the Eiffel Tower was built for the World's Fair.
I know. Crazy.
Yeah. Even in Nashville, we have a exact replica of the Parthenon in Greece, and it was built for the World's Fair.
Is it like smaller?
No, it's to scale.
What?
Yeah, it's an art museum now, but it's huge.
That's crazy. Yeah, at least I guess with the World's Fair, like the Eiffel Tower is iconic. So there's beautiful art and sculpture that comes out of it. I guess a stadium, how beautiful can it be? You know, can it ever become like the symbol of a city? I don't know.
Because that's why they're white elephants.
Yeah.
Just don't do anything.
Yeah.
But just to paint the picture of how much this costs, for the 2014 Winter Games in Sochi, it cost $50 billion to host, $20 billion for the 2016 Summer Games in Rio de Janeiro, and a reported $39 billion for the 2022 Winter Games in Beijing. So we're talking massive, massive budgets.
And those numbers are including the infrastructure investment, like somebody improving their subway system?
Yeah, that is everything that goes into it. Those are like the final numbers that independent analyses come out with years after the fact.
Okay, makes sense. The consequences of this massive spending impacts countries really differently depending on their economic situation. For the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympics, China was close to a national budget surplus and could afford to spend. The spending on the Olympics actually likely only amounted to just 0.5% of total national investment over the past 5 years because China was just growing so much. Whereas for Athens, who hosted the 2004 Games that cost $15 billion, the Olympics tipped that country into an economic crisis that was literally called the Forever Crisis because it seemed to never end. Another example, Rio, they had to declare a state of emergency because they went over budget and the government needed to secure the funds to even be able to host the Games. It definitely can change the course of your city or country's history for the worse.
Denver made the right decision to vote against it. It makes no sense for the taxpayers to have to foot this bill. I read something where Russians will have to pay $1 billion a year just to finance the debt of the Sochi Olympics.
Yeah.
For the foreseeable future. It's like a perpetual debt at this point, just because it was so much.
I feel like China is the only case where I could make the argument that hosting the Olympics was worth it. They saw 2008 as a chance to introduce themselves to the world. And while other developing countries also look at the Olympics as an opportunity to do this, China was in a position to spend money, as I said, and the timing for them was great. Obviously, 2008, most of the world was struggling with a financial crisis. China actually was largely unscathed by that because their financial system was relatively closed. They also have very strict capital controls, which limited financial losses. So the world basically watched this super elaborate display of power and wealth with their massive spending on the games and also huge opening ceremony. Did you watch the opening ceremony in 2008?
I'm sure I did. I don't remember. But
Yeah.
I'm sure I did.
I mean, it was a huge moment. I sometimes get served these videos about North Korea and like everybody's very synchronized. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I've watched a documentary on this before.
China was that level of synchronization, but also like light show, so much production value really went into it. They wanted to show the world, quote, how democratic, open, civilized, friendly, and harmonious it is. And the people of China really supported it. 97% of Beijing residents said it boosted national pride. Thousands of regular citizens enrolled in state-run English and etiquette classes to help make visitors coming for the Olympics feel more welcome. George W. Bush and his family attended the Olympics. Like, the tone was definitely warm and welcoming the world. I think that theme song is literally like, Welcome to Beijing. But by the time the 2002 Winter Olympics came, which Beijing also hosted, China was in a really different place on the world stage. They had achieved a lot of success in the last decade and felt a lot more confident in their political system and economic system. Compared to 2008, when China was just known for manufacturing and their GDP was $5 trillion. I mean, it sounds like a lot, but that grew to $18 trillion by 2022. And its attitude towards the West has changed to one of skepticism rather than openness or acquiescence. So I really wanted to look into, now that more than a decade has passed, what does the data actually say about the direct economic impact of the Olympics? Obviously, the soft power, national pride elements are there, but what about the promises from the IOC around tourism, employment, environmental impact? So the 2008 Olympics generated $3.6 billion in direct revenue compared to the $40 to $45 billion in costs.
Oh, what?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of those costs went to infrastructure, which, the IOC would say that shouldn't be in the budget. The country was going to spend that anyway, which obviously is hard to say that they would have done all of that. Clearly, they did build specific things for the games, like the bird nest and the stadiums, but they did also spend over $1 billion on transportation, extending Beijing's subway system, their light rail system, and constructing a ton of new roads. They also built a whole new wing to the Beijing airport, so obviously those things are still being used. I tried really hard to find other specific statistics around what China actually got in return for hosting the games, and there actually wasn't a ton I could find Googling from the American web. I think a lot of the research is probably done in Mandarin by Chinese researchers, but I did find this PhD researcher who was clearly bilingual. And so she looked at a lot of those original sources in her thesis on this topic, and she found that there were actual benefits. So she made the point that you should actually start looking at impact during the pre-games period, so 2002 to 2007, after the games have been announced and China has already begun making the capital investments. During that period, Beijing GDP tripled, and a lot of that impact she did map towards the IOC contributions. So in the chart, which I'll drop in the video, Beijing was growing, but like steadily, and then you clearly see this spike. So if you look at China's overall GDP, maybe that's just a drop in the bucket, but for Beijing, it certainly made a big difference.
No, I think that's a really interesting case study too, because it's almost like a perfect example of how there are so many factors that had to happen to like make this happen. Like China was doing really well during the recession, as you said, so they had the money and the funds to actually fund the Olympics. But it's interesting that you wouldn't have seen that if a city that had already built their infrastructure beyond what China had in 2008, they wouldn't have seen that big increase. So it's like the perfect confluence of factors to really help the city modernize, become the big superpower city that it is now. That's so interesting that this is like sort of the catalyst, like all right, we're going to do it all now.
I mean, I think also China's unique in that it was quite closed off, even from a tourist perspective. Like the researcher I mentioned, she found a 15 to 25% increase in tourism, aside from just what would have been normal growth. And I think China's probably also unique in that sense, in that, I mean, I certainly didn't know anyone in my network in 2008 who was traveling to China, whereas they were like going to Japan, right? So I think culturally it just felt like a lot more difficult to travel to China. And some of that I think has certainly changed even today. I just had like some friends who have no connection to China go there, and I was shocked. I was like, oh, you're not like concerned about the language barrier? And they were fine. They were fine. Okay, so in the past, when I've visited China, because I've always gone with family, how you pay for things is really advanced, right? Like you can pay via QR code and very much a non-cash economy at this point. And so I would actually struggle to pay for things because in China, you cannot open a bank account unless you are a Chinese citizen. And a lot of those apps and digital payment technologies would only work if you had a bank account in China. So even if I had cash, I literally could not buy anything at Starbucks because I had no method to pay for things unless I was with a family member who had a payment method. So that's like my memory as like a young adult going to China. But now this friend who just went, he was saying like they had no issues. Like now it's very much connected to the international monetary system. And like as foreigners, they did not obviously have Chinese bank accounts, but they were able to still use the digital payment infrastructure, but just connected to their American credit card.
Yeah, I could think of a few economic incentives to
have some more
Western bank accounts.
Exactly. Have some more external money.
I'm sure that data is connected for a long time too. So there's probably a few things they can do.
The last point I'll make is just at the time there was a lot of environmental improvements. And I think this is interesting because obviously we saw the same thing with Paris and the Seine. So in 2008 in China, like air pollution was a big issue. People were concerned about athletes just breathing the air. The smog was so bad. And obviously it had been bad, but it was the Chinese citizens who were breathing that air. And so then when China hosted the Olympics, it just became a huge part of the world stage. And China like put a big effort into cleaning up the air. And so they invested in 20 projects to improve the air quality of Beijing, which cost $12 billion. And they also just
that's like the whole budget.
Yeah. No, that's on top of it. That's not even in the budget, girl.
I know. That's probably their like proposed budget was probably less than $12 billion.
Yeah, totally. And like they stopped coal production for a whole year and just did these things that obviously like were not sustainable. And so actually like most of the improvements dissipated even within that year by the end of the year. So very sad. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you'll tell us a lot about the Seine and like, everything that went into that. Like a lot of this like push for like, I don't know. I feel like with Rio, there was also like, we need to clean up the slums was part of the message. And like, there's so many things to like quote unquote beautify or change the country to like make it more appealing for the Olympics that just, they don't do it sustainably. It's not actually anything that ends up lasting.
No.
So really just to like wrap up this section on China, like, yes, maybe there was like some very, very minuscule small economic bumps to China because specifically of the Olympics. I mean, the reality is like why China is now a superpower is not because of the Olympics, but because of like all of these other factors that have brought it to where it is. I do think from a soft power and like cultural place on the world stage, it was extremely significant. I don't know that without the Olympics, China would be as a part of culturally the conversation as it is today. I think like economically it obviously would have been, and politically, because as soon as you matter economically you start to matter politically. And so like that would have always been there. Like China would have always still been second in the world and like a threat to the United States just by that very fact. But I think like culturally, even today, Chinese culture has not penetrated America as much as like Korean culture. But I do think just so many people knew like so little about China. And like maybe all they knew was just about communism. And I think all of the broadcast coverage of even the people and like the opening ceremony, a lot of those cultural elements like the dances, the music, I think if not for that, I just don't know when that would have ever come into the world's consciousness because China is relatively closed off.
Yeah, definitely. I think the soft power argument is really significant for China especially, but I feel like that's always been the cornerstone of why you host. To bring it to Paris, I honestly don't know why Paris would want to host the Olympics. They have enough soft power as it is. There's no entering onto the world stage at all. And since it is such an old city, infrastructure is notoriously more difficult to conduct in these older cities. Cleaning up the Seine, I mean, it's been like that for forever. Almost quite literally forever. It's been like the sewage system of the city.
Yeah.
You can't swim in it. It's been illegal to swim in the Seine since 1923. And even before that, I was a French major in college. And the amount of stories that we had to read from like the 17 and 1800s about women and kids falling into the Seine and drowning and then their ghosts haunting the city of Paris. It's like a cultural thing. But they announced that they were going to have people swimming in the Seine. I was like, what the hell? What in the actual hell? So yeah, that alone cost Paris. Do you want to get a guess for how much it cost them to clean up the Seine?
$10 billion.
No.
Girl, I have no sense for what numbers mean. I've been reading all these numbers that are like insane. I mean, China spent $12 billion just to clean up air pollution. I would imagine cleaning up water is harder.
Okay, so let's preface this by saying I don't think they did a great job considering they had to push off the games, didn't they? I think it was the triathlon.
I mean, literally, the first day that the swimmers were supposed to get in the water, E. coli levels were above acceptable levels.
Okay, maybe they should have spent $10 billion. But they spent 1.5.
Okay.
Maybe that's part of the problem.
Oh, man. Those athletes were like not washing their hands to try to become more resistant to E. coli.
That's horrific.
It's horrific, yeah.
Oh my God, that's horrible. Did you hear about the poop protest?
No.
I don't know if it was actually successful or not, but the French are famous for protesting in these ridiculous ways. And they were trying to protest the Olympics for these economic reasons we were talking about, especially because of the context of the raising of the retirement age. And the argument being, oh, we can't afford to keep paying for your retirement pensions. And they're like, oh, but you can afford the Olympics. So we're going to boycott this now. And they had a day where everyone organized to like shit in the sun at the same time to like sabotage their.
Wait, did it actually happen? Did they go through with?
I don't know.
That's hilarious.
Isn't that funny?
I love that. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Well, it worked. I hope that is why they couldn't actually swim in the sun, because the protest.
I'm pretty sure they did it on the same day that Macron was supposed to swim in the sun to show like, hey, it's safe. I'm going to do it. And then they were like, that day we're going to shit.
Oh my God.
I love the French. All right. So unfortunately, since the Olympics just happened / are still happening, if you want to include the Paralympics, we don't have the final numbers yet on how much this cost. So that sort of hindsight 2020 analysis that we've been able to do, can't do it yet for Paris, but they did budget $8 billion for the Olympics this year when they won the bid in 2017, which, looking at the actual cost numbers now of like the 39 billion numbers that we've been seeing, we can guarantee that they went over budget on it. However, they did say that it was the cheapest Summer Olympics in decades. The reason for that is the IOC is trying to change some of the rules to make it more appealing to host the games, one of them being that you can host in multiple co-host cities, and they're even going to implement co-host countries now to make it more, This year, the games were spread across Lyon, Marseille, and Nice, and Paris. And then, of course, they had the games in Tahiti.
Right.
Yeah. So that helped spread out the cost. And also, Paris oddly has quite a bit of sports infrastructure already. They used the existing infrastructure from the French Open and the 2016 European Football Championships, drastically reducing the costs. The split of at least what's been reported so far is that they've spent $4.5 billion on infrastructure. A lot of that did go to upgrading the metro system, and it included $1.6 billion on the Olympic Village itself, which I was surprised at that number. In other reports, I had seen that it costs about $1 billion to create an Olympic Village. But if you've seen any of the TikToks, the athletes were talking about how they didn't have air conditioning, like the food was really bad. It was kind of infamous for being a shitty Olympic Village. So 1.6 on it seemed a little crazy. The other really high cost, which I didn't anticipate, is actually the security costs, which the city has to incur. So it costs between $1 and $2 billion just for security. And it's significantly higher since 9/11. But you put all that together, and then, of course, the $1.5 billion for the sun cleanup, that gets you to your $8 billion that was budgeted. And they absolutely went over. We just don't know by how much yet. However, I did see an analysis saying that it could still be a profitable games, potentially, because of the broadcast costs. They were so high this year. On the con side of things, since it's unlikely that they will be reimbursed for all of their investments, that the next few generations are going to have to bear the brunt of this cost, which the country can't really support right now. Like, France isn't doing great economically. They have a 5.5% budget deficit, and the EU mandates that you only have a 3% budget deficit. So they're well beyond that already.
Oh, are you at risk of getting kicked out of the EU?
I think they start doing like economic, is it sanctions? What is I think sanctions is punishment, but like
sanctions is punishment.
My economics degree is not helping me right now. I'm forgetting the word for it. There's a word that they put you on, like some plans, basically, that you have to.
Stimulus?
It's kind of like a PIP program for economics.
France is on a PIP.
France is on a PIP, or they probably will be.
PIP is a performance improvement plan.
When you're a bad employee, they put you on a PIP before they fire you. So they try to be like, okay, you have to reach these goals to become a good employee again. So
yeah,
that'll be France. But anyway, yes, I think that's a lot of what went into the pooping in the sun protesting. Is the French people understand that this was not in their best interest to do. However, since the games have always been more about pride, honor, and publicity more than profits, it kind of makes sense that France would be like, no, we just want to host a banging games, show off on the opening ceremony.
Did you just make that up? Pride, profit, That was so good. Pride, honor, profit. Wait, what did you say? It had like 3 P's in it. I was like, wait, that literally sounded like music.
Pride, honor, and publicity more than profits.
Sounds like a slogan. Did you just make that up?
I mean, I wrote it down. I don't know. I probably got it from somewhere. I doubt it came from my brain alone. My theory on why they hosted is they're the French. They want to show off. They had a beautiful opening ceremony. I did not watch the closing ceremony, but I'm sure it was gorgeous too. And you know what?
Girl, people were like shitting on their opening ceremony.
It was closed-minded people. The French loved their own ceremony.
Okay.
And I loved their ceremony.
Okay.
God, we could do a whole episode on that controversy. Oh my God.
Did you watch it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't watch it, so I have no idea. I just saw the TikTok backlash about like people who bought tickets to the opening ceremony and they were like, we can't see anything. We're just sitting here by the water. It's raining. And all the videos of them holding umbrellas being like, we just left early because there was nothing to see.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I didn't know that. I saw like the televised version.
I think just based on, because it was like, again, I didn't watch it, but it was like a water parade essentially, right?
Basically, yeah. It was on
right.
the
And
sun.
so I guess like people who were standing by the water literally couldn't see anything. Like you could on the TV because they were like filming the right angles. But yeah.
I mean, that makes sense, especially because it was moving down the river. It's like,
right.
It's going to pass you at a certain point.
Wow. I don't know. Yeah.
But yeah, I was very pleasantly surprised by how meaty this topic was. I saw an article from The Economist come out a few weeks ago that was like basically a debate. Is it good or is it bad to host the Olympics? And it was something that I had never truly thought of before. I'm like, I know it's expensive, but you got to get a ton of kickback in tourism. And I never really thought more deeply than that. So I'm so glad we looked into this because I was like, damn, this goes deeper than I thought it ever did.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see if the economics change in the future because, I mean, one, this multiple host country thing you mentioned is really interesting. Like, I wonder how that even will work. But also, like, once the Paris numbers do come out in terms of, like, broadcast revenue, because, I mean, obviously my experience is just anecdotal in that, like, it felt like there was just way more eyeballs on the Olympics this year than any prior Olympics. But also, like, I wonder a lot about the existence of social media and especially TikTok and, like, video being, like, a perfect format to showcase a lot of the Olympic competitions. You know, immediately after the USA gymnastics teams performed, all of their routines were on TikTok. And like, even if you didn't watch the gymnastics tournament, you saw it on TikTok. And so those are maybe eyeballs that are going to watch at the next Summer Olympics because now they've been exposed to it and are interested. And I would be curious if those broadcast revenues can grow enough if it like does change the calculus, assuming of course they also change the cost and the bidding process. Because obviously we're not talking like, it's not like, you know, a couple $100 million in broadcast can like offset billions of dollars in cost. But if they do change co-hosting and like all these things, it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks guys. We'll see you next week.
See you next week. Bye.
Bye.
If you enjoy the pod, we would love for you to give us a follow and rate us on Apple Podcasts, which helps us get the word out and reach new listeners. Full transcripts and show notes are available on Patreon, where if you choose to become a patron, you'll also get access to bonus content, our monthly book club, and our eternal gratitude.
If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a topic for a future episode, email us at everythingiknowaboutpod@gmail.com or DM us across all socials at EikaPod, that's EIKA pod. Thanks for listening and see you next week.